Hello, my name is Dr. Nicolas Lornier, and in this presentation I will discuss organizational theory, which is a macroscopic view of the organization. And in order to do that, I will go from classical classifications of the organization, and I will afterwards move towards a view of the open system theory, which is a more contemporary view of organization theory. So first, the classical view. When it comes to the classical view of the organization, there are a few attributes which are usually identified. First, and we discussed a little bit about it in introduction of this course, identity and culture of the organization. Second, the instrumentality, which is the purpose of the organization. Third, the portfolio of activities. If it is a school, not only we have an athletic department, we also have some courses. And now in the athletic department, what do we have? Basketball, football, synchronized swimming, golf, and so forth. What is our portfolio of activity? That's another classical attribute. Fourth, there is the idea of membership. Either you are in the organization or you are outside of the organization, which leads us to the idea of clear boundaries. We can define an organization as an entity pretty clearly. We know where it starts, we know where it ends. And you see here, I wrote clear in black and not in white because sometimes that is not that easy. And I don't know if you remember, but in introduction we discussed a little bit about that, and I said that who is part of the organization and not part of the organization? If you work part-time, are you part of the organization? You know, those boundaries, they are not as clear as classical theories used to define them. Then there's the idea of permanency of an organization or relative permanency. Why? Because, well, of course, if you take the example of a college, well, maybe that college has been there for 200 years. But if you look what's going on within the college, well, teachers come and go, students come and go, politics within the school change through time. Division of labor and specialization, of course. To take again the example of the school, well, the the head coach in basketball is usually not the same person as the biology teacher, okay? Which means that we all have our tasks, okay? The president is the leader of the school, the teacher, well, teaches the student. So we are specialized, and this specialization is related to a division of labor. Now, hierarchy of authority. Usually the bigger the organization, the more hierarchy you will find. Formal rules and procedures. Well, usually you have a handbook or a code of conduct. You have contracts and so forth. So, well, all of these define the formal rules and procedures. With that said, of course, some rules are not written down. They are implicit rules. For example, when you are a professor in some colleges, at least, you are expected to dress appropriately and suit up and wear a tie and so forth. Last, structure and design, and we'll talk about structure and design later on during the semester. The structure and the designs are kind of the bones, if you will, of the organization. The structure is the way in which job tasks are formally divided, grouped and coordinated. Okay, so it is strongly related to the division of labor and specialization. And the organizational design refers to the process of creating or changing the organizational structure. Okay, so design or redesigning the structure, if you prefer. Now there are various classifications which have been used. First one is the profit orientation of the organization. Are we a non-for-profit organization? Are we a for-profit organization? That's a big difference, right? Second, who's the prime beneficiary? Okay, as defined by Bolon and Scott. First type, it's a mutual benefit association, which are unions of members. If you are a member of a cooperative, that's mutual benefit association. Business concerns is the second type. There we have owners and managers, which will maximize the profit. Third, service organization, again, where the idea here is not to serve the associates, but to serve clients with services, not goods. Okay, services. For example, think YMCA or the school students. Okay, and last, the Commonweal organization, which aims at serving a public at large. Here, think, for example, of the police or prisons or firemen. Okay, they serve a public at large. Other ways to classify organization, well, the source of funding. Is it privately funded? Publicly funded? We agree that usually these type of organizations don't work the same way. Or is it a collaboration between public and private entities? These type of collaborations are still pretty rare, but they are more common than they used to be. The second is the employee-customer interface, which is more or less complex. That's where these three types come from. The first is maintenance interactive. So here we are at the lowest level of complexity. Think, for example, of the employee at the gym, which gives you the towels. Okay. Second, task interactive. Here, for example, if you use an accountant, well, it's probably because this accountant knows more about accounting than you do, okay? And you think that your situation is too complex for you to declare your taxes by yourself. Well, here you see the employee, which is the accountant, has more power. Okay, it's not about delivering towels here. It's about a very specialized task where you have more knowledge than your customer. Okay. The third type, personal interactive. Here we still go one step further. The customer really doesn't have much of an idea of what's necessary to accomplish a task, but the employee knows a lot. And here, for example, that's exactly what you're experiencing between a professor and a student. You know that you need a master's degree. You trust the school and the teachers to provide the best courses possible in a specialty, for example here in organizational behavior or organization theory. And now you trust your teacher, me, to deliver a course of high quality so you become a better professional. Okay? So you see here you have those three levels of complexity. As much as in maintenance, you know how to deliver towers, right? In personal interactive, you basically don't really have a clue. You trust people to organize the best masters possible. Of course, you read reviews, but you don't really know by yourself what to expect in terms of a course. You believe that the professional, which is your professor, knows what he's doing, right? Third classification, the volunteers' participation. Of course, it is not the same thing to hire a professional to do a task or to count on volunteers. And we all know that when you, for example, organize a sporting event, let's say a marathon, well, you're going to need those volunteers. You couldn't, you wouldn't pay $10,000 for the marathon, yeah, so you can't have all professionals. But these volunteers, well, you can't really ask them as much as you would ask one professional, because by nature, well, they are volunteers, okay? So that's another way to classify organizations. Okay, so now that we studied the classical views of the organization, let's talk about more contemporary views of the organization with the idea of open systems approach. So first, what is a system? It is a set of interrelated and interdependent parts. So please try to remember these. Interrelated and interdependent parts arranged in a manner that produces a unified whole. Okay, great. We'll see what that means right after. Now, why open? Because it can be influenced by its environment. And in order to illustrate that, let's look at this figure. So here you see basically what the systems look like. That is that green nucleus in the middle. Surrounding this system, you have what we call the proximal or task or operating environment. All of these are synonyms, which are represented in light gray. And surrounding this other system is the distal or general environment. So you see we have a variety of layers, if you prefer, and the system depends strongly on the interaction that it has with its environment. For example, if you say that the system is your fitness club, well, its proximal or task or operating environment would be the fitness clubs which are close by, but also other sports or activity providers nearby, as well as the other neighbors. Depending on the relationship that we want to study, we'll focus more or less on some of these proximal environment members. Then we also have a general or distant general environment, which is so further away, like the general policies, the IRS, the federal government, the city governance, all these are part of the distant environment. And you see, of course, the system interact with both its proximal and distal environment, but also the distal environment interact with the proximal environment. So you need to take into consideration all of these interactions. And that's what we propose to do in a systems approach. And here's another way to summarize all the key elements from each environment. First, the general environment is the social, economic, political, legal, and technological factors. The task environment refers to the customers, the competition, the labor, and the suppliers. And the internal environment are the human resources within the organization, the material and facilities, the money, and also other resources that the organization will use. And here is how we see now the processes within open system. And the first thing that you need to understand is the concept of negative entropy. Entropy simply means the opposite of organization. It means is the principle of disorganization, if you prefer. Okay, so negative entropy can be defined as a sum of self-regulation, progressive segregation, and progressive mechanization. So first of all, the concept of self-regulation means that the system by itself will try to reverse this process of destruction or disorganization or decay, if you prefer, which is related to entropy. We could make an analogy here to the function of homeostasis in the body, if you are familiar with this concept. The second process is the process of progressive segregation. What does it mean? It means that a system tends to divide itself, or subdivide itself, I should say, into subsystems which are functional and specialized units. Okay, think about the differences in your organization between the accounting department, for example, and the marketing department. Okay, this organization subdivides in departments or services, some being specialized in accounting, marketing, or even, for example, coaching or teaching. Okay. Third principle is the principle of progressive mechanization, which simply means that some processes become automated within the organization. And as you may imagine, here we refer, for example, to the code of conduct or rulings or handbooks which are being used in organizations. Now, if we look at the figure on the lower part of this slide, you see two main principles, and the first is called equifinality. The idea of equifinality means that organization will start in different positions, but can still end up in similar ending positions. So here, different starting position, same ending. On the opposite, the concept of multifinality means that organizations which start with similar initial conditions can take different paths, which will lead them to different final states. So why are these two concepts important? Because it means that there is no one right way in organization. There is not one good way of doing things and make your organization evolve. Okay, so there is no one big way, one magic bullet. Okay, when you look at organizations from an open systems way. Another way to look at the organization is the input, throughput, output way and feedback. So what does it mean? It means that at first, well, we need to consider the inputs which come in the organization, the humans which will come to work in this organization, the material, that these humans will use, which have not been created in the organization, but that we use. For example, an athletic department with a basketball program, you didn't create the ball, you didn't create the basket, okay? But you still use it. So that's part of the inputs. Also the values and the expectations that we have. These inputs will be processed with our structures and also through human interactions. For example, you get your players and your coach in input. Well, within the organization, these processes of human interaction with structures and preliminary conditions will create the team and create some results. The results will be expressed in terms of output, and in our case it won't be goods but services. For example, winning the game, being better educated for our students, and so forth. Okay, the outputs can also be related to maintenance, obviously, because you need to maintain all that. So you can consider this process: inputs, throughputs, outputs. But in order to do that fully, you need to consider also the presence of feedback between inputs and outputs. We would call internal feedbacks, or also between outputs and inputs again, with regard to the environmental feedback. So internally, what do the players have to say about the organization? And from an environmental feedback, for example, what are their parents have to say about the organization, or the spectators which come to the game? Okay, so these last few slides were some main components of the philosophy expressed in system theory, and now let's see how they operate in our sporting context. And the first type of theory which has been developed and applied in management and sports management is contingency theory. What types of contingency do we have in management or sports management? Well, all the contingencies which are related to the technologies that we use, contingency related to our suppliers and distributors, because we depend on them. Okay, think about the quality of the ball, think about the quality of the playing ground, and so forth. But also some consumer interest groups, some customers, some competitors, the government, and the unions when they are allowed. Okay, so this list has been provided by Woodward in 1958. The second category of contingencies comes from Mintzberg 1979 in structuring the organization, and these types of contingency which are proposed are the age and the size of the organization. If a company is older or bigger, it tends to be not as flexible. What is a technical system in place? Is it a very refined technical system which organizes the structure, the design of our athletic department, or not? That has an impact also. What is the environment? Is it a very fast-paced environment? Is it a very difficult environment? Think a crisis. You know, after the 2007 crash, the environment has changed a lot. There's a lot of more pressure on everybody's budget. That has an impact, obviously. And the last one is power. What are the relationship of power which are in the organization? All of that can have an impact on the organization and the work which are provided in this organization. So now let's consider a second theory called the stakeholder theory. And this theory, so as it says, starts from the stakeholders. There are different types of stakeholders. Some are voluntary or involuntary. Sometimes you're involved into a situation, you know, where you didn't want to be involved. For example, a fight between a coach and an athlete. Well, you don't want to be in between the two. Okay, you can be a primary or secondary stakeholder. For example, if you pay for your school by yourself and you go to school and you are financial autonomy with regard to your parents, you are the primary stakeholder of this school. However, your parents, because they still have a strong interest in you, are a secondary type of stakeholder. Okay. Third, are you on the demand side or the supply side? So do you represent, in our example of the students in the school, do you represent the students, or do you represent members of the organization of the school? Okay, that will give you a different standpoint on, for example, some concepts like the price of the school or the quality of the teaching or the research. Okay, with this classification as these different types of stakeholder in mind, we have to say that managing stakeholder, just to sum it up very broadly, it is understanding and applying a plurality of standpoints. And this is why this view is so interesting, because it's very easy when we only consider one type of stakeholder to be very one-sided. But if we consider a diversity of stakeholder, as we've seen in previous presentations, notably when you talked about participative decision making, well, it is harder to reach an agreement, but also you make sure that a plurality of standpoints are represented in a committee. Okay. The third element with regard to the stakeholder is their salience. What is their power in an organization? How legitimate are them? And is there a sense of urgency when it comes to take care of them? Okay. For example, yes, if you attend a game and you get slightly injured and a player gets slightly injured, the medical team will go for the player and then for you. But if you are badly injured and the player have, I don't know, a sore or sprained ankle, well, the urgency goes to you, of course. Now, a third theory is what's called the institutional theory from DiMaggio and Powell. And it says that basically we need to understand the institution through the concept of isomorphism. And the idea of institutional isomorphisms mean that an organization always tends to imitate other organizations in the same institutional sphere. Okay, for example, professional football teams tend to behave alike. Okay, and this can be better explained through three key concepts, which are coercive isomorphism, mimetic isomorphism, and normative isomorphism. Coercive isomorphisms occur when the politics and the social influence that direct the organization lead it to behave in a very similar way. For example, when your activity is funded by the government, and that actually was the case a lot in France where I come from, a lot of the financial support is brought by the government. Okay, you strongly depend on the government, either the local government or federal government. So if they give you the money, well, they also provide you the same rules, the same restrictions. Okay, so this will create what we call a coercive isomorphism. The second type is mimetic isomorphism, and it means that, you know, as we said, some organizations tend to imitate other organizations and become similar, and usually we tend to mimic or imitate people which are the most successful. Okay, so the same can be said about organizations. Usually we tend to adopt the model of the most successful organizations. And the third isomorphism is what's called normative isomorphism, and it means that when people are trained to think alike, or when the culture is strong enough, there's a norm which is created, and people and organizations, same thing, will follow this norm and not try to step out of the norm. So these three ideas constitute what is called institutional isomorphism. And now, last theory is called the resource-dependent theory from Nocky 2001. You remember earlier we talked about the organization through its processes. We talked about input, we talked about processes and output. Well, this view of the organization strongly depends on the resources. For example, think about a coach. You want a prestigious coach to train your team. Well, that's a pretty scarce resource, right? So this resource will strongly dictate the functioning of your basketball program, okay? And because this resource will give you a lot of power, we can say that your organization's first priority is to get this resource, and the success of your organization depends on this resource. Okay, so here, as you imagine, the idea is that the best idea to understand organization is to look at their resources, and there are three ways to look at resources, in which are: first, what is the importance of a resource for the organization. Of course, if a resource is not important, well, maybe we shouldn't use the resource dependence theory too much, because it doesn't matter that much. Second, the control of a resource by a party. In the case of a coach, well, nobody really owns a coach, but maybe the current university, which is, or the professional team, doesn't matter, which hires this coach, has a contract which says, well, if you break the contract, you have to give us a 10 months notice, or there will be some penalties with regard to your salary, or we won't give you a bonus, and so forth. So these constraints provide some sort of control of your resource by another party, let's say another university or another professional team. And third, we need to look at the lack of alternative to secure the resource. Okay, so if you have plenty of alternatives, there are plenty of of coaches on the market, and they are basically as good as each other. Well, then it doesn't matter as much. But if you don't have that many alternatives, there are only a few very good coaches, at least at this price range, with this type of experience that you really want. Well, you know, that's not the same problem, and that's why, well, that's why coaches have a lot of liberty, a lot of freedom when it comes to negotiate their salary. Okay, because they know that there aren't that many people with as much experience as they have. Okay, that's what gives them their value. All right. So, with that said, here are the resources that I used for this presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you for the next presentation. Bye. Have a nice day.